So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the social aspects of antebellum America, which is the early 1800s. By the way, Latin antebellum means before war, so these are going to be the years that lead up to the Civil War. Okay, so like I said before, in the last segment we talked about the economic and political side of the early 1800s. Now we're going to talk about what was going on socially in America during that time. Okay. So there was a major religious revival that happened known as the Second Great Awakening during this time period. And so we see, the very popular revivals with the tents, the outdoor things, because as we see the market revolution happening and the growth of industry, we also see people become a little bit disgruntled about the way that America has changed socially. And so we see a resurgence of religious revival happening. And this time, not only, unlike the First Great Awakening, which was focusing more on saving yourself, this time they're putting thoughts into actions and helping to shape society. Okay, and so they start to people from the Second Great Awakening begin to focus on social reform here in the United States in the early 1800s. So prohibition, the abolition movement is going to come out of this, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Okay, prohibition meaning anti-alcohol. And so people that were critical of these reform movements saw that as an attack on their personal freedom. People also said, taverns are popular gathering places for politics, and so they didn't like people trying to restrict them from drinking. Catholics were super hostile to this. They felt like it was a personal attack on them, and in a lot of elements it really probably was. They saw this as Protestants trying to reform them morally, and that alcohol was to center of their own religious practices. And so they didn't like, in particular, a lot of the Catholics that were here in the United States did not like this very much. Okay, so there were some major social reforms that come out of the Second Great Awakening, and that's what we're going to focus on in this particular segment. Okay, labor reform, we see our very first labor unions form, temperance, which was anti-alcohol, asylum and prison reform, abolition, women's rights, and even education reform. Our very first public schools come about from this. Okay, so probably one of the most successful of all these reforms was temperance. Okay, you see an emerging middle class becoming leaders in the reform movement. In 1826, there was an organization known as the American Temperance Society, which sought to try to reform drunkards, okay, habitual drinkers. And a lot of this was because, and interestingly enough, women are really very much leading in the center of this temperance movement because they're very often the victims of this violence from men, okay, the drunkard men. And so you see, over here, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Women are, and it's okay with the church for women to really be a part of this and leading this reform. And like I said, it was successful. We see a huge drop. Over half of the consumption of alcohol drops from the 1830s. And but it does kind of make a lot of people angry and hostile that didn't feel like drinking was immoral and didn't like people telling them how to engage in their own morals. The next one is something known as the asylum. So the asylum are places in which you had people that were mentally ill. In colonial America, if you were mentally ill, you were put in prison, you were whipped, there were banishments and fines. Usually the mentally ill before this were taken care of by their families. They were put in orphanages, and they were really outcast from their families altogether. Many mentally ill, they don't have any kind of asylum for them or any institutions. They were put in poorhouses. They were put in jails. As a matter of fact, if you go to San Antonio Municipal Archives or Bexar County Municipal Archives, you will see in the 1800s a lot of people put in jail because of insanity. Okay? So we start to see people start to transform this because they feel that these undesirable people, they wanted to transform their character and help them so they wouldn't have to be in these reforms. And some of the, some of the treatment of the people in the asylum was just absolutely horrid. They were chained to beds. They would defecate on themselves. And so, you know, there was great need for reform at the time. Probably the leader in not just the asylum but prison reform was a woman named Dorothea Dix, and she was known like as the voice for the mad. She does a lot to try to improve mentally ill. She wants them to be, you know, stop being caged and being physically restrained and put them into mental hospitals. Okay, so the creation of like the mental hospital comes from Dorothea Dix. Out of the 123 mental institutions here in the United States, she founded 32 of them. So she was an absolute, you know, reformer when it came to that. The next one is the public school. Okay, there was a man named Horace Mann who felt that education should be the right of everyone, that you shouldn't just get an education because you're born wealthy or something like this. And he also felt that education would give people the ability to elevate their life status no matter what means they came into. And he's up in the Massachusetts area, by the way, okay? Some parents didn't want their children to do this. They were opposed to their children being educated in these, and they were concerned about these secular schools that were created. But they also offer women the very first real career as teachers. So a lot of times these common schools would hire teachers. And even though they paid male teachers more than women, it was the first time women could actually, you know, have a career. Now, this is in Massachusetts, so in the South, they really lag behind. It takes a long time for the South to really catch up to what the North is doing in public schools. All right, the next reform is pretty controversial, okay? At the time, it was seen as a reform, but a lot of people, even today, you're gonna wonder about this one, okay? So an organization was called the American Colonization Society, and that was to abolish slavery, but to send former slaves to their own country, because the people that were part of American Colonization Society didn't think blacks and whites could intermingle. Okay, so they didn't believe in the equality of races, but they also didn't believe in slavery. So they create a country, no joke, known as Liberia. Okay, so Liberia, the capital, by the way, is Monrovia. The president at the time was James Monroe, so Monrovia. And so they create this country in Liberia of former slaves that they send there. Now, this is supported by many, many leaders at the time. And Northerners, you know, like I said, they wanted to get rid of free blacks too. They didn't like the competition economically where they were. This kind of shows you how deeply racism and deeply it was embedded in society. It wasn't just in the South and slavery. And you also need to like reframe your thinking, because I think so many times students think, oh, you know, slavery didn't exist in the North and everybody in the North loved blacks. And that's just not true. Okay, just erase that from your mind because that's not factual. Okay, there was deep, deep racism. And so we're going to learn some, you know, pretty uncomfortable things about this as we get a little bit more into it. But American Colonization Society is one of those uncomfortable things. Liberia was founded by people in the United States to send former slaves so they didn't have to be intermingled in society. Okay? They thought what they were doing was morally right because they were getting rid of slavery, but they did not think that blacks and whites could intermingle. Okay, we begin to also see, though, on the other spectrum of this militant abolition. So these are people that didn't believe you should just send blacks off. These are people that believed that blacks should be free, okay? And so, by the way, I just want to point out that these are people that operate very much in the fringe of society, meaning these were the outcasts. These were the crazy people, okay? There were very few abolitionists at the very beginning, okay? Even, you know, it takes a long time for people to reframe their minds and think abolition and freedom for blacks, okay? So they were against colonization. They wanted economic, civil, and political rights. They want to use force if necessary, okay? They invoked the Bible and the Declaration of Independence, saying we're not all free. And they also encouraged blacks to take pride in their own heritage, okay? We're going to see things like this really emerge a lot in the early 1900s, too, with the Harlem Renaissance movement. We also see, and this is one of your sources of one of your potential primary sources, and probably one of my favorite characters in American history during this time, a man named William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, he found something called The Liberator, which was a abolition newspaper very first, and he also forms the Anti-Slavery Society at the same time. Now, interestingly enough, Garrison, he believes very much that, Southerners should be condemned for what they do, and he publishes his newspaper even in the South. He calls for the absolute abolition of slavery. Today, The Liberator still remains one of the most influential magazines or newspapers during that time period. There's a couple clips that I encourage you guys to watch. One is on Frederick Douglass and his feelings and what happened, what he wrote from his Narrative of the Life of a Slave, which is an excellent, excellent book, and also his interactions for the first time with Garrison. Garrison is the one from the Anti-Slavery Society that discovers Frederick Douglass and really propels him to the public sphere. Okay, so Garrison, he did not believe in violence, and neither did Frederick Douglass at first. Okay, most of the abolitionists do reject the idea of violence. They thought that they could convince Southern slave owners that their ways were wrong. They wanted to kind of awaken America into this idea of the evils of slavery. He thought that changes would need to be made in the North too, because just like I talked about before, it wasn't just a matter of thinking in the South. It was in the North. They didn't necessarily economically need slaves, but they certainly didn't think blacks were their equal. Okay, at the same time, like I talked about, Frederick Douglass is propelling to fame. He writes, what is the slave to, what to a slave is the 4th of July, which was very monumental at this time. Let me move this down so we can read this. So this is what he talks about in it. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. So, Frederick Douglass, one of the most well-known abolitionists at the time, and again, a product of Garrison's discovery. Okay, moving on from abolition, although it's arguably one of the most interesting ones, we see the very first beginning of feminism. And this really emerges because a lot of women were involved in the abolition movement, and they begin to ask for not only black rights, but equality for women. They kind of circulate petition. They bring awareness to the subordinate role that women were placed into. These two women down here, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, some of the most famous abolitionist and women's rights advocates in that time period. They were actually the children of very wealthy slave owners in South Carolina, and they become prominent abolitionists. Sarah Grimke wrote letters on the equality of sexes and that women should receive equal pay and equal treatment and things like that. It culminates, the Women's Rights Convention itself culminates into the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the ladies right here, organized that in Seneca Falls, New York. And for the very first time, suffrage, which is women's voting rights, were discussed in addition to many other issues going on with women. Okay, they write something known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which was, a mocking of the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at them side by side, they say, they basically, instead of King George, say men. And they basically in that condemn inequalities that they suffer and things of that nature. Okay, a lot of women themselves want to participate in the market revolution, and they're able to through the Lowell mill workers and places like that. We also see different people emerge, like Sojourner Truth. She was a black woman in the abolitionist movement, but also pro-women. Interesting note on her, she was actually illiterate. She didn't read and write, so anything that she produces was transcribed. Okay. We also see people like Amelia Bloomer, who talks about what happens, and if you look down here, what happens to the women's body when they're they're pushed into these corsets, and she kind of pushes for them to have a little bit more equality in dress. Okay. Anyway, that's about all I have on the reform movements. This is very, very interesting, vastly interesting, and so your primary sources will actually be connected to these different reform movements. So I hope you guys have a great week. We'll talk to you soon.